it's Tony here from Locks to Reads, with another couple of reviews and a library haul you'll all be excited to hear. So let's start with the reviews. I have finished the collected short stories of Jean Rhys, which means I have finished everything fiction written by Jean Rhys, and the project can be ticked off, which is a terrible thing to say about reading. But this was really enjoyable. Jean Rhys is not the easiest person to read. She writes difficult in the sense of the subject matter can sometimes be a bit bleak. She's very good on things like how judgmental and petty people can be, particularly English people. There's a lot of stories in here based in in Dominica, or where the narrator is from the Caribbean, and dealing with being a Caribbean in England, even a white Caribbean person, and the difficulties of dealing with winter, English racism, English judgment, English sarcasm, and unpleasantness. Some of the war stories set in the war in here are probably good counters to the sort of myth of Britain in the Blitz. There's one story in particular about a Czech woman who is living with her cousin she's an English woman who's married to a Czech, or has been living in Czechoslovakia, and who has come to live with her cousin in England, and that people are stirring up in the village that she's a spy, and the husband of her cousin makes a joke about, oh, maybe your boyfriend's being picked up by the Gestapo, and then gets really upset when she doesn't find that funny. It's very, honestly, I think the three things having finished this, the three things of Jean Rhys's I would recommend you read are basically what happened with Jean Rhys was she wrote four novels before the Second World War. The last one being Good Morning Midnight, which was published in 1939, but died on its arse fundamentally because people didn't want a book like that. Just as the war was about to start, so she disappeared off the face of the earth until the 50s, when she published Why Sargasso Sea, which is a prequel to Jane Eyre, told from the point of view of the woman in the attic. Good Morning Midnight is a fantastic book. I really recommend it. It's like she perfected the previous novels that she's written. She perfected in Good Morning Midnight, and I really recommend that. I recommend Wide Sargasso Sea, but possibly not if you're a massive fan of Jane Eyre, because it will make you think twice about Rochester, even though you should think twice about Rochester anyway. And then I would recommend reading the collected short stories. They're not, as I said, they're not always the easiest things to read. Jean Rhys's the main characters of Jean Rhys's books are often on the women on the edge. They're mostly women. There's a couple of short stories told from the point of view of men in these books, but there's not many. They're mostly women. They're survivors a lot of the time, even in the face of sort of sometimes genteel poverty, sometimes actual poverty. And a lot of them are on the receiving end of judgment and disappointment. There are lots of terrible men in Jean Rhys's books. There are lots of terrible women in Jean Rhys's books. There's a lot of a lot of her characters often say like they hate women, either directly or words to that effect. There's a lot of things about lack of trust in here as well. It's Jean Rhys is not. If you want to read something happy and upbeat, Jean Rhys is probably not your person. I mean, to quote here from one of the late short stories, but it was always the most ordinary things that suddenly turned around and showed you another face, a terrifying face. That was the hidden horror, the horror everybody pretended did not exist, the horror that was responsible for all the other horrors. Um, yeah, she's not the she's not a happy writer often. That's not to say she isn't funny. There is a dark humour in a lot of her work, but most importantly, she writes so well. Um, it's clear, it's sharp, it's witty, um, and her characters feel real. I think there's a when you look at Jean Rhys's history, there's a lot of autobiographical stuff in here. As I said, she was born in Dominica. Her dad was a Welsh doctor. Her mum was a third generation Creole who lived there. But she was sent to England at 16 to be educated. The impression you get is she never really liked England very much. Um, she tried being an actress. She tried being a dancer. Uh, and an artist model, etc., etc. A lot of the characters in here, you get the impression of a lot of these stories. She lived abroad. She lived in Paris. She lived in Vienna. She lived in Budapest. Um, she's a fascinating woman. I said the next stage really is to read some biographies and autobiographies. Apparently, there is an unfinished autobiography written by her, which I'd like to get my grubby little protuberances on. But there's also a couple of biographies. So I'd like to read more about her. But yeah, honestly, I much as it's full of people you sometimes want to grab around the throat and say, just sort your life out. It's brilliant. Really recommended. The second thing I finished was Seamus Heaney by Helen Vendler. When I picked this up in the library, I thought it was an autobiography, but it's not. It's a literary. It's a fairly academic literary criticism book. That's a very bad sentence. That analyses Seamus Heaney's poetry from. It was published in 1998. It starts with Death of a Naturalist and finishes with The Spirit Level. Helen Vendler died in 2024, so this has been out a long time. I don't know if it's been updated. This is a library copy, as I said, so it's probably quite old. It's very easy sometimes to mock academic writing, but actually, this was a really good thing for me to read for a couple of reasons. One, because it made me at the end of it made me want to read more Seamus Heaney, which will be a nice segue into the next part of this video. But it also makes me realise that if and I'm going to quote from my Goodreads account here, well, not quote, but vaguely say something that's in my Goodreads account. If literary criticism is an ocean, I am standing on the beach, my trouser legs rolled up, my shoes and socks on a towel further up the beach, dipping my toes into the edges of the water, thinking this is a bit cold. Whereas something like Vendler is deep in the ocean. So I would not this is a good book for what it is, but I wouldn't recommend it until you've read Seamus Heaney. All the books in here mentioned, because for two reasons. One, I think sometimes if you read a book like this before you've read all that stuff, and I haven't read all the stuff in here, by the way, it can put ideas into your head about what something is about, without you making up your own mind. It's like asking AI to tell you what a book is about, but actually much better than that, obviously, because it's done by another human being. The other thing is that it makes you sometimes feel like you're lost and you're not working hard enough with your reading, which I think is a truth of thing. Poetry is one of those things where I don't. There's no harm in just reading the poetry and deciding whether you like it or not without going as deep as Vendler does, or any other academic does. But there's also something in trying a bit harder to work out why choices have been made in terms of structure. I call it topography of poetry, but the layout of a poem. Why a poet chooses those subjects, why in a poetry collection, what's the theme across a poetry collection. Poets don't generally throw a poetry collection together randomly. Sometimes they probably do. But this was a good book there, and it does the most important thing, which is by the time I got to the end of it, I wanted to read more Seamus Heaney. And also, I wanted to have another go at writing some poetry. I've written poetry before. Most of it's shit. Sorry for the swearing. But I would like to have another go, because this makes me think that you should at least try a few to improve. So I can't say I recommend this unless you have read a lot of Seamus Heaney. But I would say if you have done and you really want to know more about what he's doing, then this is the way. This is something to read. Okay, so those are the two books that I finished, and I went to the library to take some of the books back yesterday that I've read. So let's go through what I picked up when I was there, because obviously you can't. If you take 4 books back, you've got to come back with 10. So on the subject, I picked up Human Chains by Seamus Heaney, another poetry selection. This is one I haven't read. This came out in, I think, quite late, if I'm not mistaken, 2012. So I'm looking forward to reading that. Short and sweet. What I'm going to do with these, by the way, is explain why I picked them up and what they're about, and you can decide what to do with that information afterwards. I also realised when reading the same Heaney book that I hadn't read a lot of poetry this year, so that played an impact in some of the things I picked. Next up, I picked up Chinua Achebe's The Education of a British Protected Child, which I think is a selection of essays. I've read some of his novels; they're excellent. I've read some of his essays also, which I found really, really interesting. So this was just a pick up for me to read some more of a writer whose work I like. Next up, this battered old Samuel Beckett collected poems, 1930 to 1978. This came out in the 80s, I think. Yeah, it's very confusing. 1984. I'm a fan of Beckett's plays, even though I don't always understand them. See also Harold Pinter. So I've never read any of his poetry, so I thought I'd give that a go, and it's a reasonably short selection. Next up is Adonis selected poems. I don't know if it's pronounced Adonis or Adonis. He was born in what was then Greater Syria, which has been split up by colonialism into several other smaller bits. Lived in Lebanon for a long time, became a Lebanese citizen, moved to Paris, and lived in Paris for most of the rest of his life. It's a poetry collection. He's considered to be one of the great modern-ish Arabic poets. I think if you're reading poetry, you should try and read poetry from all over the place. Obviously, this is translated because I can't speak or read Arabic, but I'm looking forward to reading it. I've heard good things about Adonis. And then I picked up 2 books about 18th century into 19th century England. A Subject for Taste, Culture in 18th Century England by Jeremy Black. I had tried to read this before, but kept renewing it and not getting very far. So I grabbed it because I've developed a real itch for 18th century English history recently, especially the cultural stuff. And actually, Bury the Chains kind of helped with that. And reading Jane Austen's Library as well. The combination of those two really sort of focused my interest in 18th century England. And that's the other reason I picked up Decency and Disorder, The Age of Cant, 1789 to 1837 by Ben Wilson. I know nothing about this book apart from the fact that it looks right up my street. And I think it's meant to be about how our perceptions of this period are not quite in line with the actuality. So yeah, that's my library choices and the reviews. I hope you find that interesting. I will pick up on another video when I finish some more books. I have to make a decision now on what to read next, because I've still got 2 books that I am in the middle of. One is no point worrying about it now because we can keep this on the 15 minutes if we keep going. So yeah, so that's it. Have a good one, and I will catch up with you all soon. Bye bye.